The 17th of September, 1876. Helena, Montana Territory. Margaret Lindström stood in front of her late husband's cabin with 2 sacks of flowers, a splitting maul, and exactly $7 in coins, while the first light snow of the season dusted the Alorn Mountains behind her. Her husband had been dead for 3 weeks. His brother Eric had given her until sunset to clear out. Only 6 hours of daylight remained, and the almanac predicted the coldest winter in a decade. She was 41, spoke English with a heavy Swedish accent, and owned almost nothing beyond what she could carry herself. Temperatures would drop to 20 below within a month. No boarding house in Helena would take a widow without references. The nearest farm that might offer work was 43 miles east, and she had no horse. But Margaret had spent the first 12 years of her life in Dalarna, Sweden, where her father burned charcoal in forests that made Montana look tame. She knew quite well how to survive when the world wanted you gone. The problem wasn't shelter. If the ground cooperated, she could dig a small dugout into the hillside above Prickly Pear Creek in 2 days. The difficulty lay in firewood. A Montana winter required at least 4 cords of split wood for a woman living in a 12 by 12 space. That wood had to stay dry, or it would only smoke instead of burn. And smoke in a confined space meant waking up dead. She had seen it happen to a Norwegian family in '74. The usual way was to build a separate woodshed, an 8 by 12 structure, milled lumber, tin roof, raised floor. Material costs alone ran from $30 to $40. Margaret had $7.47 days before the first killing freeze if the weather held. She walked south along the creek until the canyon narrowed and the north-facing slope became steep enough for snow to drift 8 feet deep in January. Perfect. She found a spot where an old rockslide had created a natural semicircular alcove, about 11 feet wide, cut 6 feet into the hillside. The exposed rock curved like the inside of a barrel. If she could seal the front without spending money she didn't have, the hillside itself would block snow and rain. The rock mass would hold heat from any fire she built, and the elevation kept it above the floodplain where Prickly Pear Creek turned into a torrent every spring. 4 men watched her from the Helena Lumber Company log yard 200 yards downstream. She felt their skepticism as a palpable pressure. By noon she had cleared brush and begun the real work. The creek banks grew thick with young cottonwood and willow, none over 4 inches in diameter, but green enough to bend without breaking. She felled 12 saplings, each about 14 feet long and wrist thick, using a 2-man crosscut saw she borrowed and returned before sunset. The trick her father taught was simple. Greenwood bends, drywood breaks, and the curve forced into living wood today becomes permanent tomorrow if done right. She drove 2 stakes into the ground at the alcove opening, exactly 11 feet apart. Then she took the first sapling, buried one end 18 inches on the left, bent it in a smooth arch over the opening, and secured the other end on the right. The sapling formed a perfect half circle, like the rib of a covered wagon. She repeated it 11 more times, each arch 16 inches apart, until the frame looked like the entrance to a tunnel carved into the hillside. Thomas Brennan walked up around 2 in the afternoon. He had been foreman for a Northern Pacific survey crew before taking a claim near Marysville, and he had no patience for fools. "Mrs. Lindström," he said, removing his hat. "The idea you're building looks rather interesting. It's a woodshed, Mr. Brennan." "A woodshed?" He looked at the arches of saplings, now beginning to hold their curve even without walls, roof, or floor. "Not yet," Margaret answered. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be rude, but you've got about 6 weeks before snow is deep enough to bury this whole gulch," Brennan said. "You plan to live through the winter in a hole with a fence made of branches?" "I plan to keep 4 cords of wood dry," she replied. "Living happens somewhere else." Brennan glanced at the 7 remaining saplings she had cut, then at the alcove, then back at her. "Cottonwood and willow won't hold under snow weight. The first big storm will collapse anything you put here. Snow will slide down the slope 20 feet above and come right through." Margaret said, "I won't build high enough to catch it." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Just put his hat back on and walked away, shaking his head. The sun was lowering when Margaret began weaving. She saved the longest, most flexible willow shoots, hundreds of them, each 6 to 8 feet long and pencil thin. Starting at ground level, she wove them horizontally through the upright saplings, over, under, pulling each strand tight before moving to the next. It was like basket weaving, but at the scale of a building. By dusk, she had completed 3 feet of curved lattice wall from the rock face on both sides, gradually closing the front opening. The weave was tight enough to stop wind, but open enough to let moisture escape. She returned the borrowed saw and spent her first night under a tarp stretched between 2 trees, listening to distant wolves arguing. September 18 brought a killing frost that finished off the last summer wildflowers. Margaret worked through the cold, weaving willow until her hands bled and the wall reached 5 feet. The structure began to look like something half buried in the hillside, half woven from living wood, curved like an overturned boat. A few miners stopped to watch. Most left puzzled, but Samuel Chen did not. He had come from Guangdong province in '69 to build the Transcontinental Railroad, stayed when the job ended, and now ran a small freighting outfit supplying the mining camps. He had seen enough structures built 100 different ways on 2 continents. "This design," he said in careful English, "reminds me of structures in northern China, earth and wood combined." "I'm Swedish," Margaret replied, "but the principle is probably the same. Work with what you have." "The curve is very clever," Samuel said. "It distributes weight, but those willow branches, they will dry and shrink, gaps will appear." Margaret had thought of that. "Not if I seal them properly." "With what?" "Oiled paper costs money. Canvas costs money. Clay is free," she said. "And there's a deposit 200 yards upstream with enough body to hold." Samuel tilted his head, reassessing. "You're going to do wattle and daub?" "Close enough." He smiled for the first time. "It could actually work. If the clay doesn't crack when it freezes, mix in enough grass and manure and it won't crack," Margaret said. "The Mongols have done it for 1,000 years. The Swedes figured it out about 500 years ago. I'm just late to the party." Over the next 4 days, Margaret finished the woven wall and began plastering. She mixed clay from the creek bed with dried grass, horse manure from a nearby stable free, if you hauled it yourself, and a little water to make a thick paste. She packed the mixture into every gap in the willow lattice, inside and out, building up layers until the wall was 3 inches thick. The work was slow, filthy, and made her shoulders ache. But the structure grew solid, waterproof, windproof, the kind of wall that could laugh at a blizzard. The roof was harder. She had no money for milled lumber, no money for tin, no money for cedar shakes, but she had bark. The ponderosa pines on the slope above had thick, plate-like bark that peeled off in 2-foot-long, 14-inch wide sheets. In 2 days, she collected 73 pieces, climbing trees until her hands were sticky with pitch. Then she shingled them over the arched frame, overlapping like roof tiles, securing each with bent willow pegs. The bark sheets hugged the curve of the structure perfectly. Rain would slide off. Snow would slide right over the domed roof. Now people started paying attention. This is what you need to understand about frontier communities in 1876. News traveled slower than weather, but judgment traveled faster than both. When someone tried something new, especially a woman alone, especially a foreigner, especially one with no land and no money, the community usually split into 3 groups. Those who wanted you to succeed, those who wanted you to fail so they could feel superior, and those who genuinely wanted to help but didn't know how. Margaret had representatives of all 3 watching her work. Father Heinrich Miller represented the skeptical religious side. He was a Lutheran pastor who had emigrated from Bavaria in '68 and believed strongly in traditional social order. On September 24, he approached while Margaret was waterproofing the bark roof with a mixture of pine pitch and rendered tallow. "Mrs. Lindström, the congregation has discussed your situation. We can offer you housekeeping work in exchange for a room in the church basement for the winter." Margaret kept working. "That's very kind, Father. What exactly is the housekeeping?" "Cleaning, laundry, preparing meals for church functions, the usual." "How many hours?" "About 30, maybe 35, depending on need. And an 8x10 room, shared facilities, adequately heated." Margaret climbed down the makeshift ladder of pine branches. She wiped pitch from her hands and looked straight at the pastor. "Father Mueller, I appreciate the offer, but I'm 41 years old. I've buried a husband and 2 children, and I've worked every day since I was 7. I don't want to be a servant in a church basement. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Lindström. So is wasting what the Lord gave you." she replied. He gave me 2 hands and a mind. I'm using both. The pastor's face darkened. This structure you're building is improper, indecent. A Christian woman should not live in a hole in the ground like an animal. I'm not planning to live in it, Margaret said. I'm building a woodshed. My dugout is 20 feet east. She hadn't actually dug the dugout yet, but the pastor didn't need to know that. This will fail, Mueller said. When it does, the church's offer may no longer stand. Then I'd better not fail, Margaret answered. If you're watching this because you value the kind of practical knowledge that people once bet their lives on, techniques that really worked when there was no backup plan, no hardware store, and no one to call for help, please subscribe to the channel. We're documenting methods that once kept people alive in conditions that would kill most of us today. Hit subscribe to help preserve this knowledge before it disappears entirely. By September 28, Margaret had spent 5 of her $7. A box of 90 penny nails for 60 cents. A pound of rendered tallow for waterproofing at 40 cents. 2 yards of burlap for a door flap at 30 cents. She traded her late husband's pocket watch for a small sheet iron stove missing one leg, which she propped with rocks. The remaining $2 would buy enough cornmeal and beans to last through October if she ate sparingly and supplemented with whatever she could forage or trap. The woodshed was now functionally complete. The structure was 11 feet wide, 6 feet deep at the rock face, and 7 feet high at the dome peak. Total interior space about 66 square feet. The curved walls and roof formed a self-supporting vault with no interior posts or beams. Air could circulate through small vents she left near the top of the walls, preventing condensation and mold while still blocking rain and snow. Now came the real test. She spent 3 days chopping and splitting firewood, mostly lodgepole pine. The species grew thick in the valleys above the creek and burned very clean if properly seasoned. She worked from dawn to dark, swinging the maul until her palms blistered, then bled, then finally calloused. Each piece was stacked inside the dome in careful order. Large rounds at the bottom for stability, smaller splits on top for airflow, all slightly tilted so water could drain. By October 1, she had 3.5 cords stacked to the ceiling, leaving just enough room to crawl in and retrieve wood as needed. The first real storm arrived on October 3. Not snow yet, just cold rain for 36 straight hours, turning the creek into a brown torrent. Temperature dropped to 34 degrees. Wind gusts hit 40 miles an hour. Margaret sat in her still unfinished dugout, just a hole in the ground with a tarp overhead, and watched water pour down the slope above the woodshed. Every drop slid off the bark roof. The curved shape directed all water to the sides. Not a single leak. Not one drop penetrated the sealed clay-plastered walls. When the storm passed, she opened the burlap door and checked the woodpile. Bone dry. She pulled a split piece from the middle and examined it closely. The wood felt exactly the same moisture as before the rain, about 14%, perfect for burning. No mold, no dampness, no water stains. Thomas Brennan appeared that afternoon with an odd expression. Mrs. Lindström, I owe you an apology. Margaret was digging her dugout, shoveling dirt onto what would become the sod roof later. For what, Mr. Brennan? For thinking you didn't know what you were doing. He pointed at the woodshed. I checked it after the storm. The structure is solid. Not just solid, very clever. Thank you. How much did all this cost you? Margaret leaned on the shovel handle. Let's see. Nails, tallow, burlap, and the food I ate while building. Last I figured, about $6.20. Brennan stared at her. Last year I spent $38 on my woodshed. Milled lumber, tin roof, raised floor. Yours is better. Yours probably looks nicer. Looking nice doesn't mean much when you're trying not to freeze to death, Brennan said. Would you mind if I brought a few people to see it? I know 3 miners who need wood storage before snow, and they're all short on cash. Bring them, Margaret replied. Word spread the way it does in small communities. By mid-October, Margaret had shown 7 different people how to build a sapling-arched woodshed. She charged nothing for the knowledge, only saying that if anyone had extra food or supplies, she would be grateful. In the end, she received more dried beans, smoked venison, and cornmeal than she could eat in 3 months. A mining engineer gave her a wool blanket that had belonged to his late mother. Samuel Chen brought a bundle of Chinese newspaper for insulation and a jar of pickled vegetables his wife had prepared. The community slowly changed its view of her. She had proven something more important than social propriety or religious approval. She could solve problems with intelligence and labor. In a place where survival was never guaranteed, that was worth more than anything. Real winter arrived on November 12. Temperature plunged to 8 below overnight. 6 inches of snow fell, then 8 more, then 12. Wind screamed down from the Continental Divide at 60 miles an hour, building drifts that buried fences and made the Helena Road impassable for 3 days. This was the kind of weather that killed the unprepared. Cold seeped into every crack in every wall. Wind sucked heat from any structure not built right. Margaret's dugout held steady at 48 degrees inside without a fire, thanks to the Earth's natural warmth. When she needed heat for cooking or warmth, she fed split wood from the shed into the small 3-legged stove. Every piece burned clean and hot because it was completely dry. But a crisis was coming that had nothing to do with her own survival. On November 19, a Swedish immigrant family, the Johanssons, arrived in Helena after a miserable journey from Minnesota. A speculator had promised them homestead land, but it turned out he sold parcels he didn't own. They had no money left, 3 children under 8, and winter had clamped down everywhere. The father, Lars, coughed violently, as if his chest were being torn open from inside. The mother, Karen, 6 months pregnant and exhausted to the point of collapse. Father Mueller gave them temporary shelter in the church basement, but made it clear they could not stay past Christmas. The basement was needed for church functions. And besides, able-bodied people must fend for themselves. The implication was plain. Lars was too sick to work, Karen too pregnant to work, the children too small to help. Margaret heard about it from Samuel Chen, who had been hired to haul a few of their belongings from the train depot. That evening she went to the church and found Karen trying to soothe the children in the dark, cold, musty room heavy with despair. "How much firewood do you have?" Margaret asked. Karen looked up, startled. "Maybe enough for 2 weeks if we conserve. Lars can't chop more in his condition. You need at least 4 cords to make it to spring." "I know," Karen said softly, "but we have no money to buy wood, and I don't know who would sell to us with Lars like this." Margaret calculated quickly. Her own woodshed held enough for the winter with some to spare. She could cut more if needed. There were still plenty of lodgepole pine on the hill, and she still had strength. But the Johansson family faced a death sentence without fuel, and Lars's cough suggested he might not make it to spring anyway. The issue wasn't whether to help. The issue was how to help without making them feel like charity cases, because dignity still mattered to people even when they were about to die. "I need workers," Margaret said, though it was a lie. "I'm planning to build 2 more storage structures before spring, one for vegetables and one for tools. Wages in wood instead of cash. 1 day's work from the children gets a week's worth of split wood. They stack, I chop. Fair enough?" Karen's eyes filled with tears. She understood exactly what Margaret was doing, but the story allowed her to accept. More than fair. Over the next 6 weeks, the 3 Johansson children, ages 4, 6, and 7, came to Margaret's place every afternoon after morning lessons with Father Mueller. She taught them how to stack wood properly, how to read weather and clouds, how to tell which trees burn clean and which only smoke. She chopped while they stacked piles in the corner of the church basement allotted to the Johansson family. By Christmas, they had enough fuel to last until April. Lars died on the 8th of January, 1877. The cough was tuberculosis, which at the time no one could prevent and no one could cure. But he went peacefully, in a room warmed by wood his own children had stacked, surrounded by people who had come to help because Margaret showed them that helping each other was the only way everyone survived. In February, Karen gave birth to a healthy girl. She named the child Margaret. Historical records confirm this for those who like primary sources. The Helena Weekly Herald ran a short piece on the 3rd of March, 1877, describing a clever frontier architecture developed by several industrious residents to solve the firewood storage problem. The article specifically mentioned barrel-vaulted structures made of woven willow and plastered clay, built at very low cost but extremely effective in harsh weather. No names were given. Newspapers of the era rarely credited women's work, but the timing and description match perfectly. More importantly, the 1,880 Montana Territory census lists Margaret Lindström as a landowner with property valued at $180, a substantial amount for a woman living alone. The enumerator also noted her occupation as teacher of practical building techniques. By then, she had helped 43 families build various structures using scavenged and foraged materials. She charged according to what people could afford, sometimes cash, sometimes labor, sometimes just a promise to help others when needed. The domed woodshed design spread across Montana territory, then into Wyoming and Dakota. Many variations appeared. Some used pine bark instead of willow. Some incorporated scavenged lumber. Some built stone foundations, but the core principle remained. Use natural curves, available materials, build for the actual climate rather than the wished-for one. If you're still here, if you've followed this far in the story of a widow building a woodshed in 1876, then you've grasped something important. This isn't just history, it's proof of human problem-solving when pushed to the edge. It's evidence that intelligence will matter more than money or status when survival is at stake. Subscribe to help preserve these stories. Hit the button and help us archive knowledge that once truly kept people alive. The technical advantages of this design are real and measurable. Traditional milled lumber woodsheds in Montana in 1876 typically cost $30 to $45. Margaret's design came in under $7. Traditional sheds required purchased materials, dimension, lumber, cut nails, hinges, roofing. Her design needed only nails and burlap. Everything else was gathered or foraged. Traditional sheds stood exposed to wind and required regular maintenance as boards warped and gaps appeared. Her design was half earth-sheltered, self-supporting, and virtually maintenance-free because materials expanded and contracted together with temperature changes. But the most important point is this. Traditional sheds kept wood dry by raising it off the ground and covering it with a roof. Margaret's design kept wood dry by blending into the terrain and using the earth's thermal mass to regulate moisture. Traditional sheds fought the environment. Hers worked with it. The comparison is almost unfair. $7 versus $40. 7 days of labor versus 3 weeks. One person instead of needing multiple helpers. And the end result was identical. In both cases, the wood stayed dry enough to burn clean. Why don't we build this way anymore? Because we don't have to. We have lumber yards, hardware stores, Home Depot, building codes, inspectors, and specialists ready to work if you have the money, and that's perfectly fine. Modern construction techniques are generally better, safer, and more durable. No one is saying we should abandon engineered lumber to go back to weaving willow, but something is lost when we forget that ingenuity can substitute for money, that observation matters more than credentials, that the person everyone underestimates might know something that could save your life. Margaret Lindström died in 1903 at age 68. By frontier standards, she was quite wealthy, owning 320 acres, a large house in Helena, and shares in 2 mining claims. Her obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned her contributions to practical architecture and noted that she taught an entire generation of settlers the value of adapting traditional techniques to frontier challenges. What the obituary did not say was that she started with $7 and a deadline, then turned it into an estate by observing how trees grow and remembering what her father taught her in Swedish forests 40 years earlier. The original domed woodshed stood until 1912, when a forest fire swept through Prickly Pear Gulch and burned everything in its path. By then, the design had spread throughout the western mountains. Today, you can still find traces if you know where to look. Collapsed, arched frames in abandoned mining camps, stone foundations overgrown with grass, or sometimes photographs in historical society archives showing a curved structure that looks almost like it grew naturally from the hillside. There is a broader principle here that applies to any era, any circumstance where resources are limited and risks are high. The principle is this: the best solutions often come from those who cannot afford to fail and who always observe how the world actually works rather than how they wish it worked. Margaret couldn't afford milled lumber, so she studied how trees bend. She couldn't afford a tin roof, so she observed how bark sheds rainwater. She couldn't afford height, so she watched how snow moves across terrain. Each limitation forced her to observe more closely, think more deeply, and find answers that people with more money might completely miss. That is not romanticizing poverty. It is not glorifying suffering. It is simply the reality that urgent need sharpens observation in ways comfort never does. And there is one thread that ties the whole story together. Margaret did not just save herself. She saved the Johansson family. She taught 43 other families how to build better. She created a body of knowledge that spread across 3 territories and helped people survive for decades. All because she refused to accept that no money meant no options. That $7 woodshed was never just a place to store wood. It was proof that the system is not fixed, that resourcefulness has value, that one person with enough determination can change the odds for everyone around them. So when you face your own winter, whatever shape it takes, whatever deadline is approaching, whatever resources you're missing, remember this. Margaret Lindström had $7, 6 weeks, and a brother-in-law who wanted her gone. She turned that into a shelter that performed better than structures costing 6 times as much. She turned it into a teaching career. She turned it into a legacy that outlived many generations after her death. The question is not whether you have enough resources. The question is whether you observe carefully enough to see what is really in front of you. If this story means something to you, if you see the value in preserving knowledge about how people truly survived when there was no room for error, then before you go, do one more thing. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that content like this should be shown to others who might need to hear it. Every like is a vote that this kind of content has value, that practical knowledge deserves attention, that stories about real human problem solving are worth more than mere entertainment. Margaret Lindström's domed woodshed kept wood dry through 6 winters before she built a proper house and no longer needed it. But the principle remains. The idea that you can work with what you have, that nature provides templates if you're observant enough to read them, that poverty and isolation do not have to be a death sentence. Those ideas mattered in 1876, and they still matter today. The world has changed, tools have changed, but the core truth endures. Intelligence and determination can overcome almost anything. And the person everyone underestimates may be the one who figures out how to survive what's coming. Margaret knew that. And now you do too. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring historical stories. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.